The thing that's at the core of the Afro-pessimist argument is an ontological account of blackness that says there's something about blackness that just is, that isn't socially constructed, where we can't trace historical forms of racialization.
Right now, you're seeing the Israeli state, for example, brutalizing the colonial subjects that are Palestinians.
When we talk about Afro-pessimism in particular, that's kind of a contemporary example of the types of solidarities it erodes. Because Afro-pessimism says non-white people of color, or any non-white people of color, are on, junior partners to the white oppressor. Not in those exact words, but pretty much in those words.
Hi, I'm Ashok Kumar. Welcome to the Verso YouTube. I'm very happy to be joined today by Kevin Okoth to discuss his book, Red Africa. Thanks for joining me, Kevin.
Thank you for hosting.
I really enjoyed the book. It's a great primer. It's a great intervention. I learned a lot. So I guess the first question, most obvious question is, what is Red Africa?
So for me, Red Africa represents a particular kind of tradition of Marxist anti-colonial thought that emerged after the first wave of African socialism. But also there are some members of, some figures I count to Red Africa that were also there during the first period of African socialism. So just to kind of break down their histories a little bit, the kind of first period of African socialism kind of began in the late 50s with kind of the first wave of independence on the African continent. Then, it was kind of what is often described as a more humanist African socialist tradition, which kind of emphasized the socialist elements inherent in traditional, whatever that may mean, African culture. It had its various pitfalls that I think we'll probably be able to discuss later on. But then kind of that tradition was followed through sometimes coups, or people were assassinated, or in other ways, just that kind of project came to quite a tragic end. The second generation of African socialists, however, were kind of was a more Marxist tradition of African socialism, which oftentimes they were kind of very distinctly Marxist figures in the first wave too. But out of this second wave, I think what I emphasize in the book very specifically is the Lusophone anti-colonial tradition, who were very distinctly Marxist, who had learned from some of the mistakes of the early African socialists, and who had kind of been radicalized by the realities of Portuguese colonialism. These are kind of the main figures I like to kind of group together as Red Africa, but as we'll discuss later on down the line, I think there's many figures from the first wave who would also kind of overlap with this particular tradition in terms of their emphasis and what they tried to achieve with the project of national liberation.
Yeah, one of the key sort of foils that you use in the book to sort of, discuss the evolution of things into the present and how we've gotten to where we've gotten is Afro-pessimism, or Afro-pessimism 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it? What, in the most simplest terms, and I know it's kind of, you've explained it very well in the book, but maybe you can explain what it is.
Sure. It's kind of, Afro-pessimism is something that emerged around, I would say around 2000, the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007. Kind of also then kind of gains traction with the Obama presidency too. And I think it kind of does emerge out of, there is something about Afro-pessimism that makes it interesting because it's not a liberal anti-racism, it's something quite different, but it's nonetheless opposed to kind of radical politics. But it's something that presents itself as vastly more radical than a Marxian analysis of race, for example, would be. And this kind of discourse emerges, I think it definitely has something to do with kind of an idea that during the Obama years with individual upward mobility and improvements in individual upward mobility for Black people in the United States, but that there kind of was a sense that nothing had fundamentally changed. So you're still dealing with police brutality, mass incarceration. Black people still kind of have the same skewed chances in life. So I think that's kind of where that discourse comes out of. I mean, in the book, I describe it as a discourse that also reacts to the legacy of the failures or perceived failures of civil rights, which is kind of the longer history that I feel like that comes out of too. And I think it's a discourse that emphasizes, or that kind of falls back on a very, very committed pessimism. So it says that anti-Black violence is something that is inherent in the modern world. It's something that cannot be overcome through social struggles. It's, the world relies on anti-Black violence to reproduce itself. So this is something that has come to being in the modern world, and that we can't, fight against through, for example, socialist struggle. So the thing that's at the core of the Afro-pessimist argument is a conceptualization of blackness that equates it with the legacy of chattel slavery in the United States. So their conceptualization of blackness is that black people are kind of characterized by this condition of the slave, which places them outside of the political realm, meaning they can't articulate their demands politically. And it's kind of an ontological account of blackness that says there's something about blackness that just is, that isn't socially constructed, or that isn't, where we can't trace historical forms of racialization, but it's kind of something that essentially just is. So this is kind of what I mean when I explain about the ontological accounts of blackness as something that just is. There's nothing, there's no history to it almost. It's just an essential quality that black people have. And I think this kind of discourse, I find, I think we'll get into that. I find a good launching pad to get into discussions of various different formations that have made critiques of Marxist, for example, political thought, because these arguments tend to overlap quite a lot, but it does define itself, Afro-pessimism, very much in opposition to a Marxist understanding of politics. And that's why but it stands in opposition to Marxism, but is not a liberal anti-racism. And I think for that reason, I found it very, very interesting as a point to kind of explore some of what I think are anti-communist tendencies in decolonial studies and black studies.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about it is that in talking about this sort of evolution towards what we find with Afro-pessimism, is that, really in the 1970s and 80s, and you kind of get into this a little bit, but quite a bit actually, is that you have a movement not just in anti-imperialist struggles and anti-racist struggles, a move away from universalisms and a critique of Marxism, right? All of these different movements seem to just, a lot of the way that they're shaped and circumscribed is around a critique of Marxism, is that they move away from that. Actually, this is post-structuralism and postmodernism and post-colonial theory, and all this stuff is sort of moving towards the particular, and they're saying, oh no, you can't have these universalisms. What's interesting about Afro-pessimism is that they're making a universal claim really off of a case study of the US, and I would say by extension, if you look at sort of Frank Wilderson's memoir, also South Africa, but I mean, that may or may not be feeding into some of Afro-pessimist thought. But what I'm curious about, and they're not social scientists, is there any kind of, and you kind of push back against this quite a bit, but what is the empirical basis for their claims about this sort of universal, transhistorical, or at least starting from the transatlantic slave trade, structure of race in which black people are, sort of immovably at the bottom, and white people are at the top, and everybody else is sort of second in command to whiteness?
Right. I think there is a part of Afro-pessimism that doesn't see itself as making a historical argument as such. So I think Wilderson, for example, oftentimes says this is a theoretical, not a historical relation, for example. Because even the idea of that characterizes the condition of the black person, or what they theorizes the condition of black people, is based on the concept of social death, which was coined by Orlando Patterson, sociologist and kind of historian of slavery. But he kind of was describing the historical condition of enslaved people who didn't have access to property and kind of were living in this were living basically a life outside of the social structures. But they kind of extended into this long life and kind of take it out of a historical context and make it this condition that characterizes black life more broadly. I mean, what did always confuse me about it is a universalizing argument, but it's a universalizing argument without any consideration for specificities. So I think, what I get into in the book a little bit is, the different histories of slavery and the different kind of hierarchies that were created in plantation societies. They always kind of depended on these specific contexts, and racialization depended on these specific contexts. So we couldn't ever say, they take the example of chattel slavery in the southern United States as the kind of launch pad. But, these racial dynamics between kind of like a binary of black-white were not the same in different plantation societies in Brazil, for example, where there's a way more complicated kind of social structure. So what confused me about Afro-pessimism as well is this universalizing impulse, but without paying attention to any of the historical particularities. And I think this is also, it's a point that I kind of make as well. It's somewhat also a result of a universalizing impulse of kind of the North American Academy, which is sometimes just by its sheer amount of resources can make these kind of claims. It's an institution that exists within the these are institutions that exist within the imperial center. They can shape a discourse. So oftentimes, you know, the American experience or the US experience will shape that particular conversation. But yeah, I think we can definitely talk more about some of those things in a bit.
You know, you say, for example, that it's a radical school of thought. I guess it depends on how we define radical. I mean, certainly it's more radical than liberal reformist thought, but I guess if we think of radical only in terms of is it possible to change society versus is it impossible to change society sort of paradigm, then yes, it's very radical because it's saying you can't change anything because you have to, I think this is a direct phrase, but you have to end the world before you can end blackness.
Yeah, that's almost a direct quotation.
Which is definitely radical, but it doesn't open up radical possibilities, right? And in that way, I guess my question is twofold. Firstly, the question is, because I find a lot of Afro-pessimist writing quite difficult to discern, and I think that's certainly the case for a lot of people, I'm curious whether, and it's also quite relegated to universities. It grew out of universities and sort of born and sort of engendered in universities, but it has this wide influence. The language is sort of used very widely, and even the kind of way of thinking is widely. It's spread very quickly, across especially across the Anglo-American world, but I think across Europe as well. The question then becomes, what comes first? Is it the ideas of people like Sexton and Wilderson, who then, like you said, cherry pick from Orlando Peterson and Horton Spellers and ideas that what you call cannibalized all these different movements, and you just cherry pick different ideas? Or is it that this impulse already existed, and then sort of Wilderson and others were able to ride that wave and then give it some ideological structure?
I think there is a way in which it kind of picks up a sentiment that is already there, and kind of, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of idea of despair can seem quite convincing in the face of cycles of police violence and brutality against black people in the United States. It's like, it can seem I feel like it's kind of the thought that it's never ending and there's nothing that can be done about it seems appealing, right? So even when we consider, what happened after, the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders, and we kind of have this cycle of uprising, big solidarity movements across the world. But then I think, as it fades, maybe there's a kind of space for that idea of despair as, we are unable to institutionalize some of these gains and able to really make political gains out of this moment, then it might leave another opening for kind of these theories of despair, which then again become convincing because these cycles of violence just do seem never ending. So I think it kind of gives voice to that particular sentiment. In terms of some of its other kind of focal points, I think that's why I talk a little bit about Negritude, which we might talk about later. It's not, ontological or essentialist accounts of blackness are not new either. Kind of trans-historical ideas of equating Africanness with blackness, or, this kind of has a history, which I try to show in the book. Particularly also what I think is their critique of Marxism has a very long history. And, the structure of the argument that they make is not much different than the argument you'll find partly in some of Cedric Robinson's work, in an anthropology of Marxism, for example, which kind of takes up this broader sentiment that I think does exist beyond Afro-pessimism. Kind of an aversion to Marxism does exist quite a lot outside of just this particular formation. The idea that, Marxism is Eurocentric, that it kind of has nothing to offer either decolonial or black struggles because it does come from this particular kind of European tradition of thought and has as its case studies only France, Germany, and Britain, and therefore it limited applicability. Marx never bothered to conceptualize slavery or never thought about slavery, and then kind of jumping off into an argument from there about how it's impossible to think about slavery through a Marxian framework. So I think all these arguments are actually not new. They're recurring arguments, and they're arguments that have been had before. I just think what I try to address a little bit in the book is some of my frustrations with the structure of those arguments, and I think is trying to make, it's also trying to make Afro-pessimism part of a bigger, or kind of a symptom of a bigger conversation that's ongoing. And I think that I would like to pinpoint kind of what the precise criticisms of Marxism are, and if they hold up, or whether we need to think about these things in a different way.
Well, let's get into that. you said, okay, yes, there's this long, kind of legacy of people basically movements and ideas forming out of critiques of Marxism, and I would say caricatures of Marxism. You talk about Robinson's kind of reduction and divide and conquer. I guess the first question, and this can bring us into the discussions of the sort of long history of these things, is what's the primary criticism of Marxism from the Afro-pessimism perspective, but also what is maybe a kind of beginning of this evolution? Like where does it stem from?
The key claims is that Marxism simply sees race as a divide and conquer strategy. It's a mechanism that's invented by capitalism essentially to divide workers and kind of constrain the possibility or prohibit the possibility of cross-racial solidarity and the emergence of a truly multiracial working class movement. So it's kind of saying that that's a reductive way of understanding race and understanding how race functions. So that's kind of one of Afro-pessimism's key claims. I think it is the kind of, classic conversation that comes up a lot in the race-class debates. It fails to be able to think anything other than class as the base of kind of capitalist social relations. So instead of being able to conceptualize how race feeds into kind of the economic base, it just kind of has this very simplistic understanding. That's the claim on Afro-pessimism's part. And then I think their biggest claim is that Marxism doesn't recognize how much slavery contributed to the development of industrial capitalism or capitalism more broadly. Where do these things come from? I guess I've written previously on Cedric Robinson, where, I had a hunch that also, we kind of need to put a lot of these conversations into context too. Because Cedric Robinson, for example, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, an anthropology of Marxism is published around 2000, 2001. This is the era of neoliberal triumphalism, the end of, history narrative. Communism is defeated, and, so people are kind of, these are kind of theorists that are moving away from kind of that way of thinking about politics because there's a global shift away from it. So I think it definitely has, I would say it definitely has something to do with that as well. Because you can kind of see in Cedric Robinson's work, for example, him looking for different forms of resistance that aren't kind of communist, essentially. And he's kind of trying to theorize what are these different forms of resistance that are, after the end of, communism as a viable alternative to capitalist society. And he's looking for this other alternative. So I think it definitely has something to do with that. Then part of what I do in the book as well is try to make Afro-pessimism part of a longer history of kind of the emergence and then decline of third worldism in US universities, where, these kind of conversations seem more appealing, but with the defeat of the third world project, it kind of fades away, and kind of this association with radical kind of anti-colonial Marxism specifically, maybe also, what I try to show with the tradition that I call Red Africa, like these connections that were there at some point, in the 60s, for example, you had conversations, or in the 60s and early 70s, you had conversations between radical black campus movements who were kind of supporting the independence struggles in the Portuguese colonies, whose leaders were anti-colonial Marxists. So these things weren't seen as being incompatible at the time, but kind of as the third world project fades, which too is kind of a mechanism of the rise of American hegemony, these things start to lose their appeal even within the academy. And then the kind of theorizing we get tends to be a very de-radicalized, kind of more meditative and reflective kind of form of political resistance that's theorized.
Yeah. You go into sort of great detail about the shift that happens, really because of the failures of these, or at least the sort of successes of neoliberalism or neoliberal ideology, and that spreads around. And it's sort of interesting how language that, we go back to the question of what is radical, what's not radical, language that is not sort of the language that you'd find under like sort of mainstream neoliberalism, but in the university, it's like using the same language as sort of anti-colonial movements. So, for example, when you're talking about the use of Samir Amin's idea of delinking. Mm-hmm. So delinking under anti-colonial struggles is then sort of taken into the university and used discursively. And maybe just as an example, what's the difference between how it's applied practically in the way Amin talks about it in the third world, and what it means when it's then sort of transformed into this kind of neoliberal device with sort of radical aesthetics?
I think it's kind of, the way Sami Amin meant it was he's a critical, he was a critical political economist. So he's thinking about delinking in terms of how do kind of nations in the global south basically enable themselves to have some autonomy from the global capitalist system, right? From the imperialist system, and how can they kind of form blocks perhaps together, and how can they kind of be able to economically delink so they can kind of build political power as blocks. We can talk, I guess, a little bit more. He's often been mischaracterized too, Sami Amin, because he does also emphasize that in order for this kind of delinking to take place, there must also be genuine kind of socialist revolutions in these nations in the global south. So he's not, oftentimes I've come across mischaracterizations that say, oh, it's just about these states delinking in it. Yeah, but it is a political economic project of delinking from imperialism. When it then gets taken up in decolonial studies, a lot of times it's about delinking and it's about knowledges. So it's about delinking from Western systems of knowledges. So where I find some of these overlaps, I find that in, a similar argument too in Robinson in his book Terms of Order, for example, where it is an attempt to delink from kind of Western systems of knowledge that are kind of provide the categories for social domination. What I think happens though in decolonial studies is by kind of moving that concept, delinking from the realm of critical political economy to that of kind of epistemology, what happens is they kind of get caught in this structure that Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called romantic particularism. So it becomes about emphasizing the kind of goodness of all kind of pre-capitalist social relations and indigenous kind of societies in a very kind of strange, uncritical embrace or elevation of that above everything else. So it becomes an extreme. Decolonial studies, for example, becomes is opposed to, or like is different to Afro-pessimism in the way that it kind of becomes a very, very kind of small particularism sometimes, yeah.
Right now, you're seeing the Israeli state, for example, brutalizing the colonial subjects that are Palestinians, and you'll see, some decolonial scholars coming out and saying, "Oh, this is a misreading of Fanon," and there's a kind of in the realm of epistemic violence and discourse.
Yeah.
It's that in theory you'd think, oh yeah, these things can work in tandem. You can have anti-colonial struggles that seed the analysis through the political economy or critical political economy, and then discourse is just an addendum to that or is supplemental to that. But in lots of ways, these different ways of thinking or thoughts or ideologies or schools of thought are contradictory. And in what ways do you think that, practically, you can see that it's contradictory because forms of solidarity that would naturally be extended are now not necessarily?
But I don't know if it's per se contradictory, because I think we have, encapsulated in a figure like who I think does both of these things well, is who I mentioned at the end of the book is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan novelist and playwright who remained, he's always been a Marxist, he's always been a firm supporter of national liberation struggles. But he's also had this emphasis on decolonization and epistemic decolonization. But for him, that's not a contradiction. It kind of feeds into this other project. So one's not a way to kind of devalue the other or discredit the other. Rather, they kind of do form a coherent whole. And I think in the book, that's also what I tried to do, is not dismiss it all the way, but it's saying that, this kind of the idea of national liberation, especially as you're talking now with the Palestinian struggle, it's not only a historic concept. It's not something that happened, and there's ongoing national liberation struggles. And I think if we do take decolonization seriously, then it is seriously talking about what those will entail and what the structure of those is, and also supporting those. So I think those, I say a line in the book that, what decolonial studies does is elevate the purity of the project above anything else, which I think is always a detrimental move when it comes to really existing kind of movements for national liberation, because this kind of level of purity can't exist in the real world.
Going back to Robinson, so we've touched on Robinson a little bit, but there's this kind of growing, especially since he passed away. There's been a real kind of growth and resurgence of thought and engagement with Robinson, particularly Black Marxism, his book Black Marxism. And you also see Afro-pessimists use bits of it in their sort of universalizing claims. I guess maybe we can clarify, Robinson's critique of Marxism and Marxist thinkers in his intervention of not only racial capitalism, and I feel like racial capitalism is often used kind of as a way to emphasize race within capitalism. If that's the case, then I think there's no problem. It's not really doing much either. But in the way that Robinson means it, maybe you can sort of expand on that a little bit and how that might that's also somewhat of a critique of Marxist thought.
I think the idea of racial capitalism catches on because I think it's, it is also time, I think, to have a good faith argument or like good faith engagement with kind of Robinson's work. But I think it does catch on because it is kind of an intuitively appealing concept for us to think through capitalism, because we understand that capitalism is racist, or the way it kind of functions today is racist. So it's kind of thinking about the historical roots of that and thinking about structurally how does that work. I guess the interesting thing about Cedric Robinson's kind of Black Marxism is it's kind of taking these different things and almost like these different discourses and terms and kind of removing the Marxism from it. So racial capitalism, as some people may know, has its origins in a South African kind of Marxist tradition, which is trying to theorize, why, there were implications at the time by international organizations that economic growth would eradicate, almost like Eric Williams type, like the growth of economic growth, capitalist economic growth would make kind of racism redundant, apartheid redundant. It would basically become bad for profits. So at one point, apartheid would end because it's no longer beneficial for capitalism. And what the South African Marxists were arguing is that that wasn't in fact the case. Capitalism actually, the more economic development progressed in South Africa, the stronger the apartheid state got. So it was trying to theorize these things. For Robinson, he kind of then picks this up and it becomes almost a universal argument about how capitalism, so from this kind of very specific case, it becomes a universal argument about how racism basically was written into capitalism, maybe for lack of a better way of describing it. So he says then all capitalism is racial because he traces kind of the origins of racialism to medieval Europe, of where, different forms of hierarchy and difference are created, and then there, capitalism emerges, and then these hierarchies and differences are made meaningful by the emergence of capitalism. Whether that's kind of, I'm not a medieval historian, so I found the impulse interesting in terms of, as a good way to think about it. And, that earlier part of the book, I always read Black Marxism as two halves.
Yes.
The half about racial capitalism and the other half about Black Marxism. So, that's kind of, there we get into, I go into a little bit about the debates between, race and the emergence of capitalism. That's a very specific historical debate where I think Robinson makes a contribution, whether we agree with it or not. The contribution is an interesting one. Yeah. Now, the second half of the book is the one that I've always had the most difficulty with, because that kind of, the book was called Black Marxism. The second half of the book was dedicated to basically erasing the Marxism of Black Marxists. So it kind of ended up having the opposite impulse of what the title implied. Yeah. And I think that's where I kind of had the issue. And I think that's kind of almost the thing that gets taken up after Robinson and quite a lot of thinkers in not only in the US, but just Black thinkers more generally, is this idea that we can think about Du Bois without thinking about Marxism. Yeah. Although Du Bois was, as committed of a Marxist as you can get. Yes. Or we can think about C.L.R. James without, we can think of him just as someone who wrote about the Haitian Revolution and Black liberation, but we don't kind of, we aren't able to think about his Trotskyist commitments. Or, it becomes the same thing as George Padmore. And it kind of becomes an almost erasure of this of these Black thinkers' Marxism. And I think that's kind of where the problem for me came in. And that's the problem I think that a lot of kind of commentators on Robinson have taken up. It's this idea that these thinkers, yes, we can say they went beyond what was orthodox Marxism at the time, but that doesn't mean it kind of exists outside of it or completely divorced from it. It's just picking up Marxism and adapting it and using it and kind of, And I think what Robinson misunderstood, is the kind of exit of individual figures from the Communist Party, and then kind of elevating that to a theoretical argument about their relationship with Marxism, which I think is not correct, but then gets taken up and kind of gains traction in this, what I think is an incorrect way. And then maybe this brings us a little bit too to thinking about the kind of figures I speak about in Red Africa, because these are people, if you're talking about Amilcar Cabral, it's impossible to understand his political thought without it's being in conversation with Marxism.
Of course.
That's how it developed, and saying it any other way would be almost bad intellectual history even.
I mean, I guess, to me, I share exactly the same sentiments. The first half is an interesting historical read. I may disagree with some of it. I mean, I think, he traces his race back to antiquity even, not even medieval history. And I'm like, okay, it's interesting, and some of it, there's some truth, but I have a lot of criticisms, but it comes from a kind of much more, I learned a lot from it. But I guess the second half is where I'm like, okay, there's a tradition of Black thought that is having this conversation, but also critiquing Marxism, right? Whereas here, it's dispossessing Marxism from leading thinkers of Black Marxist thought and replacing it with this idea of this sort of Black radical tradition, which often people use sort of flippantly without understanding what that phrase is actually attempting to do, that Robinson's calling the Black radical tradition. I guess in some ways that's a little bit, I guess that brings us to maybe some of the figures that you talk about in the book. And for example, when you talk about Mbembe, you're looking at how he juxtaposed his own position vis-a-vis the Marxist tradition, really in relation to the state and non-state. So, like for example, Robinson is like, okay, people are exiting the Communist Party, which is a kind of is an official institution, but not understanding that Marxism isn't just your relation to an official institution. Similarly, Mbembe is talking about it in its relationship to the state or non-state, and and I guess what I'm interested in is how is the ideas of Mbembe's similar to the kind of anti-state or non-state ideas of people like Fred Moten, or Sidi Hartman, or Stefano Harney and others.
As oftentimes it gets conflated a little bit in terms of the Marxism is critiqued for the same thing that national liberation is critiqued for, and the interaction between the two is critiqued for that same thing, which is kind of its view of the state. Because Achille Mbembe's critique is sort of, I think, a very bad faith critique of anti-colonial Marxism, because it kind of conflates a lot of different things. It says, oh, there's this formation called Afro-radicalism, which is, it's a nativist tradition that emphasizes the uniqueness of African culture, but it's also kind of a tradition that's in conversation with Marxism, that fetishizes the state, but it's also this thing. But what I try to do a little bit in the book is kind of disentangle those traditions as well, right? Because, we can't speak of, Negritude and the Senghor presidency is different from the political thought of, again, Cabral or someone. Like, they're different, and we need to kind of really come to grips with some of the differences between those thinkers. With the anti-statism, I think it's an interesting thing, because I've spoken to loads of people about this loads of time. It's, thinking about the project of national liberation without thinking about the state. I mean, I don't really understand what that project would have even been aimed at. Of course, there was attempts to go beyond the kind of nation-state form. We have it with Nkrumah's project, or proposed project of the United States of Africa, for example, a kind of federal amalgamation with particular kinds of collaboration, or Amilcar Cabral's project of liberating Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde to kind of places that are actually quite far apart, different social structures, different racial dynamics, together under the same project of national liberation. So there were all these attempts to kind of move beyond the state form, but the criticisms always happen in kind of this way of, all they wanted to do was capture the state. And what I try to point to in the book is like, that's untrue. And then I think there's a separate argument, that needs to be made in those kind of critiques by, let's say someone like the Black Studies theorist Fred Moten, where it kind of, this antagonism to the state becomes, I think, a problem for conceptualizing resistance and kind of really thinking through what we do need. That's kind of where the subtitle of the book comes from, is a revolutionary black politics. And I think it kind of works almost against being able to create a revolutionary black politics by being so afraid of kind of these real political kind of actions that need to be taken and steps that need to be taken in certain situations to capture the state in the national liberation project. But then what needs to happen after that? It's not an end, and I don't think any of the anti-colonial leaders that I speak about are part of the tradition of Red Africa thought this was an end in itself, Particularly, I talk also a little bit about André Blouin, the anti-colonial feminist, who kind of moved across various countries, Madagascar, Guinea, Central African Republic, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. For her, all part of the same project of national liberation. It's an African revolution. That's kind of how she conceptualizes it. But perhaps going back, not to kind of sidetrack too much, but perhaps getting back to some of what you mentioned about kind of Moten's critique. I think it's also important to remember that part of those critiques also did come out during the Cold War. And there's a lot of like kind of anti-communist kind of anarchist writing, not necessarily anarchist, but there is anti-communist writing from that period that is kind of fulfilling a very particular function in terms of undermining the project of national liberation in the Third World. So I think we should also always be careful to kind of see, it's kind of, Moten draws a lot on James C. Scott, for example, who kind of has a very, questionable, I think, political approach to some of these national liberation projects.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not just, or Scott or whoever, it's not just looking at, the various possibilities of struggle and the formations it takes. It's that these formations, in lots of ways, are as a mechanism to sort of, at least discursively, undermine the power of national liberation struggles.
Yeah.
I guess, you talk later on in the book about, you get into detail about Negritude. And I guess maybe to begin, we can sort of discuss what is it.
So Negritude kind of developed out of the thought of black thinkers from the French colonial empire who'd arrived in Paris. Most of them had been part of kind of a privileged group of elites in their own, an intellectual substrata in their own kind of colonial societies. But, and they thought of themselves as French. But yeah, because, that was kind of encouraged. But upon arriving in Paris as students, they realized, we're not actually seen as French by French society. We are black to them. What then comes out is, I guess, a poetic and literary intervention into racism, into European racism. So it kind of becomes an affirmation of black culture, black life and culture in the face of European racism, in the face of white supremacy. So there's different parts that the different Negritude thinkers take at this point. There's Léopold Senghor, who was later to become the first president of Senegal, who takes a very strong position, also in his poetry, but also in his philosophy, where he kind of says that, by kind of affirming the kind of value of being black, or the kind of this assertion of pride, becomes almost an ontological claim about what it means to be black, what Africanness is, what African culture is. And, it kind of becomes this kind of very strong, essential claim of what it means to be black and African. Whereas, Suzanne Aimé César, they kind of take it in a different direction, where it becomes more, what I conceptualize following Spivak as like a strategic essentialism kind of, it's necessary because there's a common shared history to kind of assert this identity for the particular anti-colonial project. But yeah, what I find interesting and what I kind of try to understand a little bit in the book is the kind of going from this kind of more essentialist understanding of blackness to, and how that kind of perhaps feeds into the politics they later did as statesmen. Because, Senghor and Césaire both became prominent politicians, but both had very questionable kind of policies as statesmen. So, with Senghor, you have a very a strong, very Francophile kind of position for what a post-colonial Senegal should look like, and almost a persecution of leftist activists in Senegal itself. So, it's kind of, So I was very interested in kind of those trajectories, or Césaire too remained very Francophile. Yeah.
I mean, on that, I think, you talk about Eric Williams, the great Marxist thinker. Him and C.L.R. James are part of the revolutionary struggle in Trinidad. He then becomes the leader and prime minister or is it president of Trinidad, and then he starts being quite authoritarian, and then he starts banning books. He bans CLR's books, and by the end, he bans his own book. It was illegal to have Eric Williams's book in Trinidad when he was president of Trinidad, which just tells you the evolution of some of these things might not be that linked to their original ideas. But yeah, I guess the question on going back a little bit to Negritude is, you have people who are quite sympathetic to that, like Jean-Paul Sartre, who are like, in Black Morpheus, who says that, this is got this kind of a bit more parochial worldview now, but it'll move naturally towards universalism. And why does he feel that? What is it about it that he feels it'll move that way?
I think it is kind of, I think he feels like because it's necessary. He feels it's necessary. He's kind of, as much as we can complain about Sartre kind of defining the Negritude, the way it was read, because he very narrowly reads it almost as like an expression of Senghor's political thought. But he was kind of, one of the few kind of very sympathetic European commentators on the anti-colonial struggle. He also, I think, recognized that it was necessary to counter the racism of French society, and it was necessary to counter it in this kind of quite like powerful, overt, kind of confrontational way. But I think he did kind of, that's kind of where his critique has always been dismissed a little bit, but that's kind of where I almost have a little bit of sympathy for it, because it doesn't make this universal turn somehow. Negritude, when we look at, that's kind of why I was interested in Senghor the Statesman, because it doesn't then, because Sartre is hoping that it will universalize itself in like a broader kind of communist politics, which the project of African socialism that's instituted by Senghor never does. And it kind of stops short of being this radical kind of transformation. But then, what I talk about a little bit in the book as well is it became one of the most productive kind of intellectual formations for Black radicals to think through their condition, if in opposition for it or with it. We get some great chapters from Fanon disagreeing with Negritude. And without Negritude, that wouldn't have been possible. It kind of provided an antagonist almost. Or, with the Lusophone kind of, from the tradition of Red Africa from the Portuguese colonies. They all kind of, start out trying to make a Portuguese Negritude. That's kind of, that's their initial first impulse is, how do we counter colonialism? Or we need to kind of culturally deconstruct this and affirm the value of Black life. But then through a kind of critical engagement with Negritude, they kind of arrive at this other politics, which is kind of a more left-wing Marxian politics. But it only happens through this engagement with Negritude. So I think that's kind of the picture, I guess, I'm trying to paint in the book of it. It's very much, I don't agree with all the things that kind of the Negritude thinkers said or did, but as kind of, as a discourse, it was kind of a crucial moment for 20th century Black thought.
Very interesting. I guess on the Portuguese front, I mean, lots of the anti-colonial movements from Portuguese colonies are the basis for, the Red Africa and their ideas. I guess what I'm curious about is what was the particularities of Portuguese colonialism that sort of allowed for these kinds of thought to flourish?
Sure. I think one of the first things was kind of just the realities of Portuguese colonialism. Portugal was still under dictatorship. Loads of the other African former colonies had already achieved independence by that point. We're talking about, the Portuguese colonies gained independence in 1975. And Ghana had been independent by that point for quite a long time. So it's kind of all the countries around them were kind of already decolonizing or decolonized. So one of the things that was able to, I think, radicalize them was the ability to almost have bases in already kind of independent states. So, Cabral could set up in Guinea because Guinea was already independent. or the Mozambican Liberation Front Frelimo could set up in Tanzania across the border, because Nyerere was already the president of Tanzania, and so they could organize in that way. The second point, I think, was just actually genuinely the realities of Portuguese colonialism. So just going back to that, it's just Portugal needed by all means wanted to hold on to its colonies in Africa because it needed them. It needed them not only as a source of raw material, but it needed them as an immigration outlet for its own kind of poor working class population. So it kind of wanted to, there came this idea of lusotropicalism, which is the idea that Portugal is preordained to lead the world towards a harmonious kind of empire. But that kind of basically just underpins a project of trying to make all these colonies part of the Portuguese state, because they contribute so much to its functioning, and without them the Portuguese state kind of couldn't really function. So I think there's a radicalization through that, because Portugal was reluctant to let go of these colonies and was willing to fight a war to continue holding on to them because they were so economically important. And then the third point was that they could learn, the kind of Portuguese in the Portuguese colonies, the anti-colonial leaders could learn from previous experiments in African socialism. So they could see what went wrong. It's kind of, if you're organizing an anti-colonial war, but you've already seen that Nkrumah has been deposed in a CIA-backed coup, you will kind of plan your revolution accordingly. So, these kinds of lessons, they'd learned lessons from the previous era. They'd seen people be assassinated. They'd seen people make compromises. So I think this kind of radicalized that particular tradition. I mean, the difficulties with the radicalization of that tradition is we are still speaking in the context of the Cold War. With Portuguese very, very desperate to hold on to their colonies. I mean, some of the people I speak about in this book, Eduardo Mondlane, was assassinated through a letter bomb a few years before Mozambique achieved independence. Amilcar Cabral, also assassinated. So you kind of, we get a lot of these kind of that tradition of Red Africa where it's violently kind of deposed because it was a more radical iteration, I think. And it was kind of, a kind of more radical iteration of anti-colonial thought than the previous version of African socialism had been, because it had learned from its mistakes. It had kind of like incorporated these. So I think we get a very different intellectual tradition in the kind of Portuguese colonies. So I think part of the Red Africa book is telling us, they were radicalized in this way, so their political thought also points to something quite different sometimes, and their relationship to Marxism is a different one, their relationship to Negritude is a different one, because they kind of become basically a kind of later tradition of anti-colonial thought. To this, in the book, I add also kind of leftist opposition. I guess what I'm trying to also do is talk about Red Africa not only as this kind of anti-colonial tradition from the Portuguese colonies, but also add to that the leftist opposition to independent governments in the 60s already. So, when we talk about the Senghor presidency and how it was repressive, part of Red Africa for me too is the communist kind of student leadership at that time. That's, so it's kind of trying to make a distinction between different forms of black radical thought or black thought and politics on the continent, which if, we used maybe an idea like the black radical tradition, would put a lot of the same people in one category who actually disagree on quite a lot of things, We'd have, the example I like is like you'd have someone like Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya who ended up, was a dictatorial figure, very much anti-communist, who would be counted as part of the black radical tradition alongside his communist opposition. So I think there's something different we need. So Red Africa is almost an attempt also to start distinguishing between these different intellectual traditions, because they're not the same and they almost exist in opposition to each other. So it's trying to rescue kind of that leftist kind of bent of anti-colonial thought.
Yeah. There is a tendency in the present to sort of cluster everyone together. I remember when Stuart Hall and Sivanandan passed away, not that far apart from each other, and a lot of people were like, oh, they're like looking down together. It's like, no, they had a lot of antagonists. They're not looking down together. If there's somewhere, they're fighting it out, right? So it's like this simplifying, sort of flattening out of these ideas doesn't do justice to those people as well. Those ideas. I guess lastly, I will say, one of the things I really appreciate about your book is that it's a sort of history of the present. It's trying to situate our present, ideas that are everywhere in a historical context, and trying to place it within that. So I guess my question is to go back to the Afro-pessimism question a little bit, just as a kind of barometer of the present, is that how are these ideas eroding forms of solidarity and social movements and various different, forms of the everyday struggle? And the second part to that is how, you kind of lay out 4 prescriptions there at the end of chapter 1 of how to envision a sort of new mode of anti-imperialism. Maybe you can describe that in the subheading of the Reclaiming Revolutionary Black Politics. How do we go about addressing this and as a prescription to reclaim revolutionary Black politics?
So let me start with the second question first. I think it's, one point that I make is returning to the critique of political economy, just to see how different states are unevenly integrated into the imperialist world system. So it's kind of really thinking about how do these states exist in relation to the imperialist world system more broadly. Then the second point, I think, is, issuing these different simplifications of like how race functions, actually taking a historical materialist approach to the kind of development of racialisms and racisms in different societies. Because only that way, I think, can we really kind of get to terms with how capitalism functions and governs through hierarchy and race, through creation of these modes, and how those kind of facilitate, basically, capitalist exploitation. So I think those are the 2 kind of main points that I think we should return to. Then the third point, I think, if I remember correctly, is made about thinking about a tradition, the anti-colonial tradition of Marxism, which actually very much in practice shows us that Marxism and Black radicalism, or the decolonization of knowledge, is not incompatible. So I think these are just like, let's also kind of rethink these things, because, I think, who was it that made this point? I think it was Enzo Traverso in his recent book on revolutions. There's a lot of social movements kind of coming up who don't have this kind of full understanding of the 20th century past, when it's the 20th century past that shaped kind of the present that they're intervening into. So I think rescuing these histories is like a very important, it may seem, oh, why are you bringing this up? But this is an important kind of thing for us to better understand the context in which we're trying to intervene, and also to learn from learn lessons from the failures of that particular project, so as not to repeat them, or kind of learn the lessons that were good from that project, so as to take them on board. It's kind of, there's a tendency sometimes to think that everything is novel, when most things aren't, the particular specificities of it are novel, but people have thought through these questions before. So I think it is revisiting kind of the thought of people who have actually very seriously grappled with the relationship between, Marxism and Black radicalism, for example, or the state form in the process of decolonization. So I think it's important for us to return to that. On the second question of solidarity, when we talk about Afro-pessimism in particular, and we see what's currently happening in Palestine, that's kind of a contemporary example of the types of solidarities it erodes. Because Afro-pessimism says non-white people of color, or any non-white people of color, are on, junior partners to the white oppressor. Not in those exact words, but pretty much in those words. And there's a famous passage in Wilderson's book where he accuses his co-worker at a museum, I think they were working together, of being an anti-Black Palestinian. But the kind of statement he chooses to illustrate that kind of racism is very obscure, because he just says, oh, he said something about being stopped by an Ethiopian Jew and how that made it even more hurtful. And he kind of goes on this monologue being like, oh, he's just racist. But really, we could also read kind of an interaction like that being disappointment with being, because he, this person might think of the Ethiopian Jew too being oppressed by a particular settler colonial state.
That's obviously what he meant. That's obviously what he meant.
And that's kind of how I read, when I read the statement, that's, I'm like, oh, this is a disappointment about the erosion of a particular kind of like third worldist solidarity against colonial forms. But yeah, and then, when we kind of then take this as the starting point and then theorize from it, some examples like this, then it becomes a thing of, oh, Black people shouldn't Black radical movements shouldn't be in solidarity with the Palestinian national liberation struggle. And that becomes, I think, a huge problem for the national liberation struggle, because it does depend on also international support.
Yeah.
Outside of that, so I think perhaps that is one of the most kind of insidious forms of eroding solidarity, that I think a discourse like Afro-pessimism, as niche as it sounds, can have an influence in kind of making that argument and making kind of Black radicals turn away from a strong critique of settler colonialism in this context.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for joining us. And
thank you so much, Ashok.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. You can buy Red Africa at the Verso website.